Given an entire week to sit in the living room because as a man of fear, I became afraid to lay down. Let me tell you what I'm currently afraid of. I'm currently afraid of going to bed. I'm currently afraid of drinking anything that isn't water. And I'm currently afraid of eating food because no one can tell me why these things happen, and I hadn't experienced this pleasure for a decade at least. It's been a decade at least since the last time I could describe to you what a kidney stone felt like. Having had 3 previous children, kidney stones myself, the 4th was the biggest of the bunch, to my knowledge, because I have never felt like that. I say verbally, they catch a lot of heat a lot of times, but I would like to say verbally, thanks to Winston Medical and the people in the emergency room. They were very kind. They were very generous to Becky and I. The sweet young lady who was scared to give my IV, you know, she was just very kind. Everyone was very kind. And another medical professional told me that if you get a male doctor who's had a kidney stone before, you get treated quicker as a male because he knows, you know, what's up. So they gave me medication that made me forget Earth existed through my arm there, and to the point that, now Becky can tell you if I'm just fibbing it up for Pastor Passion, because she was sitting there. The first round of medicine they gave me, whatever the names were, they tell you everything like I know. Like they're like, we're going to give you some blah, blah, blah. And I'm like I'm going to say, oh, I don't personally like that kind. You know, I don't know. Whatever. I don't know what you're about to shoot in there, but anything is better than. So whatever they gave me at first, it did help me sit still long enough to get a CAT scan. But then by the time the CAT scan was over, I was like, whatever that was, it's no good. And so the doctor, again, very compassionate and kind, he said, let me get them to bring you some whatever. And I'm not lying when I say she comes in with this syringe. Now, this is me, okay? I judge the potency of what they're about to give me by how much of it is in the syringe. Like if that syringe is full of stuff, I'm like, oh, baby, this is good. If it's a little tiny bit, I'm like, well, this is a joke. You know, it's a children's portion. There was 1 milliliter of juice in that syringe when she came and said, okay, he told me to give you this instead. And I'm like, what? What even is that? When she shoved it in there and she said, now this might make you feel flush. And by the time she said the word flush, the muscles in my neck that hold my head up deactivated. I'm not lying to you. Like I was literally, you know, I'm like holding my arm out and being a big baby is what I feel like I look like. But she says that and I'm like, okay, that's, and then my neck just falls backwards. And I said, I can't hold my head up. And just as calm as can be, that's kind of normal. That's what she said. And so my wife, as sweet as she is, she's like, you want to lay your head on mine? So she put her head on my shoulder, and I just kind of flopped my head over on hers. And I have no clue how long I stayed there. It was me and the space people walking through bliss until it quit working, and then they came back in with another. And so whatever that stuff is, at 1 milliliter, I hesitate to think it would probably kill you if they gave you the whole thing. The last story I'll tell you about that is that once we got home from the emergency room, they had given me some pretty serious pill form pain medication. And the doctor said, I know, so a little background, today is the day for me to tell you everything I'm afraid of. I'm terrified of going into a doctor and appearing like I'm a pain junkie. Like I don't want to put somebody in an uncomfortable position, but I also don't want to come across like I'm just give me the good stuff or whatever, I don't know. So I kept saying I don't really like medicine when we were in the hallway and whatever. And so the doctor said, I know you just got pain medicine in your IV, but I need you to take this as soon as you get home. Like when you get home, fill this prescription, take the first dose. So I did what the man told me to. And what that got me, my wife put me in the recliner. I had a case of 48 bottles of water and all the other witch medicine that people were saying, if you would eat worms for 3 days, it'll stop. You know, anything somebody told me, I was trying it, boy, anything. But Becky said that she came into the living room to check on me at one point, and I have an Apple TV. Now, you don't have to know what that is necessarily, except to know the remote control is super tiny. Like, it's a little tiny, flimsy wafer thing. She said that she walked in to see if I was okay, and I was in the chair, completely unconscious, like this. holding the remote out as though it was changing channel time, but no one was home to care what was on the TV. So anyway, sitting there in moments of lucidity, you have to understand that after 20 years of ministry, I have been able to come to this moment, whether just as a believer participating in church or music focused, or 13 years being a pastor serving from this table, as it were. I become very personally interested in how to really understand what was taking place, how to really comprehend the heart of the disciples around that table that evening, and exactly what Jesus was trying to get them to understand. So in my time alone, I began to ponder on how important it was for us to think and to recognize an aspect of this meal, the table. So today I want to talk to you about tables, and then we're going to talk specifically about what we're supposed to be doing at them or with them. There are two kinds of tables in the Bible. Not two types of purposes or two styles of tables aren't really mentioned in the Bible. We know that Jesus was born to an earthly carpenter, and so he probably had some familiarity with the design of tables. In his day, tables didn't have 4, 5, 6 foot legs on them or leaves. They sat largely what we would call on the floor. They were very short, stubby-legged tables, and Jesus would have been quite comfortable reclining at them. But then there would also be ceremonial tables, tables for display, tables that you would have with larger legs so that the things on the table were visible from a further distance. And so we have explanations of these styles of tables, but that's not what I mean, and that's not what God was gracious enough to let me ponder my way through during this past week on my own. No, as I thought about communion with the Lord, with the purpose why Jesus said, do this often. Why? Not do it. The do it is what I think people get caught up with. Do it. Because you're supposed to do it a certain way according to certain people. Do you use real wine or grape juice? Can anybody have it or just some people have it? Does it have to be on a table and covered up with white tablecloths, or can it be as sacrilegious as some might think, where the elements are just sitting on the floor in front of the preacher? Can it be something you get yourself, or does it have to be handed to you? Does it have to be served, or can you be the served? The doing of it, people get very focused on. And I sometimes wonder if it's just the human nature in us, because by focusing on the do, we lose focus on the often. Because you'll notice that Jesus in the Gospels doesn't prescribe how it's done, just that it is. What that teaches us, without saying a word, is that how you do it isn't what matters. The fact that you understand its doing, like the why. And that's something you are often doing, approaching this table, as it were, perhaps more regularly than in the actual event of a Lord's Supper communion service. So I kept thinking about tables, and that may seem like an odd thing to think, but I realized spiritually, biblically, with our relationship with God, there are only two kinds of tables. There are tables that you set, and there are tables that you turn over. Tables you set, and tables that you turn over. Now, when we think about easily tables to set, we can go throughout the Bible, and the interesting thing is, when specified for the purposes of God involving himself with his people, there's only one table mentioned. Now, there's tables for God's worship, and I'll make a reference to that in a moment. But the most common reference to a table in the Old Testament, when people are being instructed to gather around it and to focus and be his children, that table is the Passover table. The setting of the Passover table, the doing of that is quite amazing. And when you think about the Lord's Supper, please understand that that is what you're speaking of as well. So on the night that Jesus passed the bread and the cup, that was Passover. They were celebrating a meal that is to this day celebrated by faithful Jews all over the world. Now that meal, that process, it has a name. It's called the Seder. The Seder is the Passover meal, and whereas you and I might have become familiar with in our lifetime a 3-course meal, a 4-course meal, meals with courses, I don't know about you. their Seder, the Jewish Seder, this day, as commanded by God and partly today by tradition, 15 steps long. There are 15 parts of the Seder. Now, this morning, as I was looking over my outline, which is Bible references, and the name of all 15 of those steps, I looked this morning and thought, now I wonder why I thought I should read all of 15 Hebrew words to them. The Kadesh, the Urchatz, the Karpaz, the Yach, the Machadi, we don't know. We don't do that. What is the parts about the Passover that we know quite well? We know that it has something to do with unleavened bread, that there was to be no leaven. Now, is it because God is a fan of crackers? Is that why? Why is there no leaven? See, the Bible tells me, but we're sometimes a little too unfamiliar with what the Bible actually says. It's why it matters so much that you and I realize when the devil approaches Eve, he gets her with a question. He doesn't force an action. He doesn't tempt her with riches. If you know Genesis chapter 3, then you might be familiar, but if you're not, allow me to remind you. The opening statement of the devil to Eve is, did God really say? What got Eve was being unaware of the words of her father. She had, by her own quote, when she answers the devil, she adds to what God had said. Because God told her, don't eat that. She added to it. He said not to eat it or touch it. In other words, I'm not even supposed to look. I'm not even supposed to be near. There was nothing in God's command that had anything to do with proximity, with viewership of the fruit, or with appreciation of, hey, man, that fruit looks kind of fancy. But he said not to eat it, so don't eat it. No, she added. She didn't comprehend what God was telling her when he said that specific thing is the doorway to death. So don't eat that, because that's not what I want for you. So in the same way, when I say unleavened bread in the Passover, do you know why? Does it matter that I know why? Yes, it does. Because the reason leaven allows the bread to rise. But that takes time. And in the Passover, the lesson was, you go when he says to go. You are always ready. You don't have time to let your bread rise. So they eat unleavened bread during the Passover to remind themselves first of the historical truth that when it was time to get up and leave Egypt, God said, get up and go. He didn't say, hey, in a 3-month time frame, I need you to kind of have worked your way out. Get up and go. No time for baking some loaves. You got to make unleavened bread. No time. Be ready. So that's why there's no leaven in that bread. That's why it matters that I know that. Because the lesson is still true. When Jesus, the Bible says, broke the bread at this dinner, in a lot of movie adaptations, it's a great big yeasted up loaf of bread. That's not what he would have been eating, because he was breaking unleavened bread, because they were remembering Passover. That was a Passover meal. And so that's the table that ought to be set. And that's the table that we should be sitting at. The table where I'm being reminded in what I do and why I do it, that it's a reflection of God, either what he's done, what he is doing, or what he promised to do in my own life. Now, you can find other tables mentioned in Exodus 37. Exodus 12 is where you're given the Passover command. God tells Moses, I want you to tell them to do this. He talks about keeping a lamb at home, and then they're going to slaughter that lamb. And they're going to take the blood of that lamb and put it on the doorposts, but they're going to roast that entire lamb. You see, again, a sign of not having time. Don't clean it, don't remove, don't prepare it. You just roast the lamb, and then you will eat that roast. Again, this idea of constant readiness. You're ready to go. I'm ready to go. I got to be ready to go. But in chapter 37 of Exodus, they have left Egypt, and now it's time to build the tabernacle, what will become in time the temple of God himself. And in that tabernacle, all of these great artisans, carpenters, woodworkers, and sculptors, they're all involved. But in chapter 37 and verse 10, a man is building the table. And it says, then he made the table of acacia wood, 2 cubits long, 1 cubit wide, and 1.5 cubits high. I'm only telling you that because there's another table for God's purpose. That wasn't a table to eat dinner on. That wasn't a table to, like I have to have a spot at home that's called my unloading spot. The keys come out, the wallet comes out, my class ring comes off, my glasses go. I have to have a spot to decontaminate myself from the world, I guess. Okay, well, some people use their kitchen table. They walk in the kitchen table, they start throwing stuff off. Or you have a little side table just inside the door. My wife bought a little wooden sort of table device for me to put all of these things so that she wouldn't have to go around and find them for me when I couldn't remember where I had removed them. Well, that's for that purpose, see? That table that she bought for me, that little thing, that's for that purpose. I don't eat meals at that table. And so that's why she would never let me put it on the kitchen table, because that's not what that table's for. I need you to find another place, she would say. Well, here in chapter 37, this man has built a table for God's purposes, not to eat at, but it goes on in verse 11, and he designs and makes out of gold all of the utensils that will set on that table, but it's for sacrifice. It's for food offerings to be put on, not to eat me, but for God to be honored. So a table for God is the table that's being set there. Just like the table of Passover is a table being set in remembrance of God. That's the table I belong at. I can also be told in the Bible that God sets tables for me so that I can be given provision in times of trouble. There's not a soul that's ever struggled a moment in their life who hasn't heard Psalm 23. That's probably the most common and well-read scripture in a funeral or when someone's going through trouble. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Right? Everybody's heard that. You don't have to go to church a day in your life and have heard that at some point. You are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. In chapter 23, and at the beginning of verse 5, David says, you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You give me a place to sit when the war is raging in my life. You provide a place for me to belong. See, there are tables to set so that I can be set. I belong seated at the Passover table, not only being reminded of what God has done for me in my past, but what God is willing to do for me in my future. There are tables that are set to honor God, and I'll get to that in just a second, but there are tables that God has literally set for me when there is a whole host of enemies surrounding me, that I might have the provision I need to endure and to move forward, remembering what He has done, what He will do, and what He has promised to do. These tables are set for my good. And the most famous of them, yet again, a Passover table, is told to us in the Gospels, Matthew 26, John 13. But in Matthew 26, verses 19 and 20, the disciples did just as Jesus had directed them, and they prepared the Passover. What does it mean to prepare a Passover? Not only fixing food, but those things have to be put in the right spots on that table. In fact, today there is a Seder plate, and it has all these little pieces on it that you have to go through the steps. And then it says that as that evening came, Jesus reclined with those people at the table. A lot of stuff happens around a table. But you've probably had the experience where you walked into a room and there were multiple tables to choose from. If you went to school, you did this. You walk in, there's tables everywhere, and you try to figure out which one to sit at. Which one of these, do I sit with the cool kids? Am I overestimating my own coolness? And so if I sit there, they're going to cast me aside. Do I sit by myself? My personal choice of favorites. Do I be like, man, he is the most antisocial? Yes. In a social setting, it is God working through me if I am communicating, because I'm the most introverted man I have come across. I get nervous, I get sweaty, I get heart palpitations. But do you sit with these people? Do you sit with that people? Or do you go to a place, a wedding, and they have a little card with your name on it, and you're told where to sit? But you've been in a setting where you have to choose which table to sit at. And the table that you sit at, you begin to keep company with the people at that table. You visit with them, you speak with them, you share with them. The only time, the time I told Becky, man, this is the most famous we've ever been in our entire lives, when we were flown to Virginia to speak at a fundraising event. The gentleman who ran the charity asked me to be his keynote speaker because of the work they had done in our community. And so they flew us all the way to Virginia, well, sort of, North Carolina, but we spent the week with them, and so there was all these huge room, all these tables, and there was little cards for Mason and Becky Joy up at the front. I didn't get to sit where I wanted. I had to sit. And so then there's these other people, and they all want to talk to you, and I don't know you, so, I'm super comfortable. but you keep company with the people at your table. All these tables that God has set, who's the company I would keep if I sat there? If God set the table for me, who's the company I would keep? Well, it's God himself. The Father asks to sit with me at his table. But the truth is, if you'll take my metaphor, some of us are sitting at tables where he doesn't sit. We've chosen to sit at tables that have been set by people with none of our best interests at heart. People who just want company in their own misery. People who want to sit at a table with people who will make them feel good about the wrong they do or the failings that they make excuses for. There are tables that we ought to be setting and sit at. Jesus sat at this most auspicious table to teach the lesson that what he was doing was all that ever needed doing. But we sit at tables we don't belong at. Which brings us to the other kind of table, the tables that we have in our life to turn over. Because there are tables to turn over. Now, you might already know that the Bible tells us at least once, but some argue twice. Jesus goes into the temple court of Jerusalem, gets real aggravated and angry, and turns things over. Now, please understand, when the Bible talks about Jesus turning over tables. Now, this is, by the way, Matthew 21 and John chapter 2. And the reason I say he did this once, maybe twice, John does two things. He includes a detail that Matthew doesn't, which seems a pretty big deal to leave out. And John mentions more than one Passover event, suggesting that this is a different time other than the Last Supper Passover, that Jesus was doing this in John chapter 2. But in Matthew chapter 21, in verse 12, it says that Jesus comes into the temple and he sees how the church. Now note that in the Bible it says how the Pharisees, how the coin counters, those are the church people. He sees how the church is treating the people, how they're being taken advantage of, how they're being robbed, how life is being made harder for them than God had expected or asked or desired. They are making a mockery of the truth of the Bible. And it says that he drives each and every one of them out of the temple court and he turns over their table. Now, it's not like me, if you are. I picture just like us. We got 8-foot tables, I think, outside, in the gym, those 8-foot plastic tables. I picture these real long wooden tables, and Jesus is like, yeah, and flinging and stuff's flying everywhere. They would have been small tables right in front of the person doing the money changing. Okay? I just took a break. So it's like you would come to me in my little table where I had my money laid out to buy your offering or to trade with you for examining it, but it's a small table. And then my partner would have his table. My partner would have, you see? So instead of Jesus just WWE style taking one big table and throwing it, he's going down the line and just pushing over every table that he comes across. And he's chastising the church people because of what they've made his Father's house into. So the Bible gives it to us like this. Jesus entered the temple area and drove out all those who were selling and buying on the temple grounds, and he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who were selling doves. And I can give you the details, but I will. What happens is you bring me your sacrifice, and my job is to inspect it to make sure that it meets the requirements of your sacrificial offering. It has to be spotless, without blemish. If you're poor, it can be 2 doves or pigeons instead of a calf or a goat or a sheep. But I have to inspect that. And so the problem is, I'm a crook. I'm a con artist. I'm a liar. Or Jesus' more common word was, I'm a hypocrite. I examine your sheep, and the truth is, there's not a thing wrong with it. There's nothing at all wrong with this lamb. It is exactly what you should give for offering. But if I just say yes to that, I don't make any money. So I say, oh, I'm sorry, peace upon you, but your lamb has a bump on its back half, and it's not going to meet the requirements for sacrifice. So I take that sheep from you. I don't let you have it. I take it from you, and I say, let me sell you this sheep instead. And so then you buy that sheep from me, and now you're meeting your sacrificial requirement, and you're doubly poor because you had to buy one from me and you just lost the one you brought. Okay, so you're gone. Next, the next person comes up and they have their sheep. I'd be like, oh, I'm so sorry, peace be upon you, but your sheep has a little spot on his eye, and that does not meet kosher requirement for sacrifice. So I take your sheep and I put it aside. And I grab the sheep that I just took from the other guy that told him it wasn't good enough, and I say, buy this one instead. So it was just a racket. And Jesus, according to John, calls them, you've made my Father's house a den of thieves. They're stealing from their own people. And so Jesus goes through and turns every single thing over. He overturns, he upturns, he destroys the tables that are supposed to be destroyed. Some of the tables that Jesus is in the business of turning over are unfortunately the tables that we've decided to sit at. See, we've sat at the tables that have been set by the enemy, and Jesus comes to turn them over. We don't get mad at ourselves for sitting there. We get mad at him for trying to disrupt our lives because we forgot what table we belonged at. Now, when John recounts this, and again, I think there's a pretty significant argument. This I won't go into. We'd be here in seminary class for 4 hours, but in John's account, there's an extremely significant detail that Matthew doesn't include. I think there's plenty of good reason to think that Jesus actually had done this more than once. In John chapter 2, verse 15, it says he made a whip of cords, and he drove all of them out of the temple area with the sheep and the oxen. He poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. This time, Jesus takes some of the cordage either from the ground, from tablecloths, from what's laying, or I don't know where he gets it from, but he makes a whip out of it. Now, please don't picture Jesus over in the corner, holding down the stuff on the ground and braiding it together like, y'all just wait a minute right now, I'm finna let you go. He's just picking it up and holding it. It's just hanging out, okay? It's just, when it says he made a whip, he used the rope as a whip. So what that means when it says he made one, okay? But I want you to visualize, okay? We got too much of a Jesus is a hippie mindset. But Jesus is just a super Pantene Pro V, long, flowing, beautiful hair. Probably got a little curl in it so that it blows in the breeze on the Sinai Peninsula while he's out there. And that's okay. And he's got a beautiful, perfect beard. He looks exactly like he got off the boat in London, England or something, France. You know, he's a Anglo-Saxon, middle-aged, Middle Ages, Renaissance. That's how every painting you've ever seen, that's how he looks. Perfectly white, without blemish. He's just like, it's okay, everybody. Just calm down, everybody. It's okay. Come on, guys. Just chill out. And is there an aspect of Jesus trying to be calm and chill? Yes. Is there also an aspect of Jesus that took a rope and whipped a dude? Yes. And we can't detract one and have the whole. So first off, did Jesus have Pantene Pro V hair? He did not. Likelihood of him bathing on a regular schedule? Low. Okay? So moms and dads, if your kid ever says, I don't want to take a bath, you can't say, Jesus would have taken a bath, because maybe not, okay? You got to say, that becomes one of those because I say so moments, not because Jesus says so. I don't want you lying to him, okay? I don't know, okay? But would Jesus have had some big, long, or goatee? You know, you've seen those pictures of Jesus got a little, what do you call that, Fu Manchu, that goatee hang? No! It would have been me when I'm trying to grow out my beard that is never going to be real successful. Real, sticking out everywhere. He's not looking in a mirror every morning. Beard brushes and razors and all, you know, it's going to be down his neck, and he does not look like a beautiful, attractive Arnold Schwarzenegger type of Savior. Yes, dirty. That's what he looks like. And yet he is the master. And so he sees hear me, I know every preacher who's ever preached long enough has tried to do this. I'm just going to take my turn doing it too. Listen to me. He is not whipping the disciples who have been following him in the wilderness. He is whipping the people who were sitting in church on Sunday. He is whipping the people who wore suits and ties. He is not whipping the hooker. He is not whipping the drug addict. He is not whipping the this, that, or the other that we would be if they walked in the door. He's whipping us. I know the Pharisee had been made the bad guy. They're the ones who crucified the Messiah. But I would love for you to understand that using the word Pharisee as though it's an other thing is missing the fact that Pharisee in their time period meant churchgoer. It meant holy roller. Now, it was an official office. It was a title. It was high. It was me. He ain't whipping the nobodies. He's whipping the ones who should have known better. He's whipping you. Well, that's not peace, love, and kindness. That's not laid back and take it easy. That's look me in the eyes and realize how serious I make this. Jesus speaking to you, not me speaking to you. That's Jesus whipping you with a rope and then saying, but this is so important, watch where I go. So he takes the rope, John's watching, and he just starts wailing on him. Man, can you imagine the hollering and the fussing? You know it's serious because they leave the money. He whoops them with the ropes enough that the money keepers leave the jar of money. Now, you know that's a beating. That's not like, stop it. I told y'all, some of y'all know my story about my mom. Golly, my mom spanking me that one time. I told y'all, some of y'all know this. I was a little kid. She told me to quit sliding down the steps. But your parents in here, y'all think that we don't remember those little tiny things? I promise. Because this was on 6161 Afternoon Lane. That doesn't matter to you, but I moved out of that house when I was 6. So this happened somewhere between my brain working and 6 years old. We had a second floor with a staircase, and like most kids, I would go up to the second floor and down the steps. And I'm sure it made some all kind of racket in the house. I don't know. And she would stop doing that. Don't do it. Stop doing that. Okay, go upstairs. And she would stop. You do that one more time, I'm going to spank you. Well, I'm not going to tell you it didn't take me longer to do it again, but I was going to do it again. So I went up the steps, let a little time pass. I go down. She goes, come in here. I'm going to get you. I go in there. Now I'm a little afraid because now apparently I have run out of chances. You have to assume I'm about to get a spanking position, and I'm not lying to you. I'm going to demonstrate for you exactly what took place. Don't do that again. Hey, we good, boy. Let me get about 5 more minutes. I'm going to do it one more time. I mean, I knew I got mama in my pocket. That's what I learned that moment because that was it. I didn't even move, you know. Some of us think that's what Jesus was doing when he was whipping with that rope. Hey, stop. Hey, quit mistreating these people. He was whipping them so hard they left the money. But I want you to pay attention to where that table was he was turning over. It wasn't in the middle of the street. It wasn't in the brothel. That table wasn't in a gambling house. That table wasn't in the juke joint. They didn't have those, but you know, it wasn't in the bar. Where was the table he was turning over? It was in the temple. The tables that need turning over, I submit to you, are always in the temple first. Have you seen things happening in the world today and felt rage about what was taking place? Can I tell you, you probably don't have a leg to stand on to be outraged because you got tables in your own temple that need turning over first? See, the reason that Jesus could walk into his own house and turn over tables in that temple, the reason he could do that is because he had no hypocrisy in his life whatsoever. And when you don't know that Jesus takes hypocrisy so serious as to call it out 7 different times in one conversation, then you're not very familiar with Jesus. But the tables in the temple need to come. They got to go. Now, okay, well, then what does that have to do with me? We don't have temples anymore. You know, we got a sanctuary, but we ain't got no table in here that could be turned over like that. Well, I beg to differ. I encourage you this morning, for the very first time, to take your Bible, having said all of this, and turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 16, because I want to make sure your eyes see what your heart may already have heard, but has not yet begun to know. 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 16 says this, do you not know that you are a temple of God, and the Spirit of God dwells in you? Excuse me. One moment, I'm sorry, but if the temple's tables need turning over, where are the tables in your life that need turning? Because you're the temple now. Understand that temple isn't building. Even in the New Testament, even in the Old Testamental time, in the first temple period, the second temple, even in that time, though people understood it that way, temple doesn't mean building. It doesn't mean house. It means dwelling, as in where the temple thing resides. So if this is a temple to Barnabas, then Barnabas lives in it. Well, when the Bible calls you a temple, that we could change that for the purpose of understanding, do you not know that you are the dwelling place of God? And the dwelling place of God is where the tables need turning. You have things in your life that need to be flipped over, that need to be driven out with whips, not with polite conversation. Every fifth Sunday, I'm going to approach this moment of communion and a focus on Jesus and His sacrifice. But can I do that in faith if my temple table is covered in filth? And were I to be aware that Jesus were walking by it daily, He would be whipping me with rope, demanding that it be turned. If I've never told you before, anytime you're reading in the New Testament, the Old Testament, anywhere in the Bible, and something repeats, it doesn't have to be immediate. Sometimes it is. Sometimes instead of repeating immediately, it repeats chapters later. If it repeats, the Bible is begging you, pay attention. Pay attention. Okay? So you got 1 Corinthians 3:16. You can also flip, in my Bible conveniently enough, one page, to 1 Corinthians 6:19. Do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, whom you have from God, that you are not your own? You have been bought for a price, therefore glorify God in your body. 2 times in one letter, Paul says, do you realize what you are? Now, to give you a slight wider view of a misunderstanding of the temple being this building, it's the same misunderstanding the Pharisee had when Jesus said, you will tear down this temple, but I will rebuild it in 3 days. Why did they all think he was a loon? Because they thought temple meant this building they were standing near. And they thought, how could you rebuild this in 3 days? But what was Jesus talking about? Was he talking about that building? No. He was talking about himself. Because he is God. He is where he dwells. And he has chosen that you will be where he dwells. By your decision to put faith in him, to sit at the table that he sets. But yet we can't take a stand in our lives because the table in our temple is covered in things that it ought not be. Now, no one's table in this room is perfectly clean, don't get me wrong. My table isn't clean. Your table isn't clean. But the difference between some people and others is they recognize the right of the whip holder. Now that makes Jesus just sound mean and offensive. Whip holder? Well, this is how, you know how I want to be punished when, oh, we don't like that word. You know how I want to be disciplined by God when I'm living out of order? Like the way my mama did that day with them steps. I want God to be like, now son, I told you not to do that again. Come over here. And here comes heavenly discipline. Don't do it again. Oh, hey. Okay. But how did God discipline in that temple that day? Jesus is willing to do what it needs to be done to get your attention. These are the places that tables get flipped in temples, and you are temples. Every single one of you. And there are tables in here. Some of them set beautifully, and when you sit there, there is peace, there is calmness, there is ease. And some of them, when you sit there, you're trying to convince yourself that there's peace and calmness and ease. But there is a quiet suffering. There is a silent misery while you attempt to tell yourself everything is all right, but nothing is okay. See, I wondered if my wife could tell during the kidney stone era whether I was still hurting or not. And I realized that it probably wasn't that hard because the only thing I could do to try to make any sort of relief was hold my breath. So imagine the pleasure of sitting in a room with somebody who's constantly going like this. That's great. Hours of huffing and puffing, I don't know, okay? Well, some of us, while I'm doing that, do you think that she was like, oh, he must be feeling pretty good? Now, I'm literally sitting right across the room from her going, do you think she was like, oh, he's feeling better? No. But some of you are walking around your daily life doing that exact same thing, and you think you're fooling everybody. You're like, I'm fine, how are you? You're not literally doing that, but in here you are. Who are you fooling? Let him flip that table 15 different times if it's necessary, lest you be who he was talking to in Matthew chapter 23. Now, you don't have to flip there if you don't want to, but Matthew chapter 23 is home to what are known as the 7 woes of the Pharisees. 7 times that Jesus says, woe unto you. Now, what's interesting is right as that whole moment begins, Jesus tells the people, so there's people who are interested in what Jesus is saying, and there's people there trying to prove Jesus wrong. You can't say that, you can't be that, you can't do that, you can't sit there, you can't dress like that, you can't sing that kind of music, you can't sing that, you can't use that Bible translation, you can't look like that, you can't have that. That's those people. And these people are like, all I know is what they've been telling me in life is real hard, so I like what you're saying. Well, Jesus looks at them. By the way, these people are the church people. You would do yourself a great deal of good in your New Testament study if when you read Pharisee, you read church person. Because that's who they are. The church folk. They Southern Baptists. They know everything. They know the law. Jesus says to these people, do everything you hear them say, but nothing you see them do. Well, that's not a good description of the life they live. Everything they say is right. They're quoting the scripture to you, but don't do anything you see them do because they are hypocrites. 7 woes. 6 times in those 7 he says, hypocrite. A hypocrite is someone who claims to be but is not. Or claims to not and is. So for us to tell people how they ought to live and not live that way makes me a hypocrite. For me to look down on someone in a certain condition and yet make excuse for why it's okay for me to be in that same condition, a hypocrite. For me, Jesus says that these people who live this way make others worse off by merely knowing them. Now I want you to just think for a second, just unchurchify it, unreligiousize it for a moment. Do you want to make someone's life better because you're their friend or you're their acquaintance or you work with them? Or do you want to think that when they're in your presence, life is better? Or would you like to go around thinking, man, I hope that every time I walk in the door, I make their lives miserable? You're out in the car waiting to walk into the office and just rubbing your hands together. Man, I hope they're scared and complaining right now, wondering if I'm going to come to work today or not. I'm going to show them. I choose to believe that in the heart of man, there is not a desire to want someone's life to be worse. But I've lived long enough for the heart of man to prove me wrong. Some people want other people to suffer. Well, if those people who want me to suffer would then turn around and talk to me about the importance of love and grace, do you know what that person is? That person is a hypocrite. If that person can demand that life be lived a certain way, but then not live life that way, that person is a hypocrite. And the problem is, just like the Pharisee, today, sometimes, and I know I try to couch some of this final stuff in politeness. So maybe I don't. You notice that you live in a country today that can't denounce terrorism? Have you noticed that? Because if you say what happened in Israel is bad, wrong, and ought to be condemned, somebody will say, yeah, but what about? And do you know why we can't take some huge, bold, passionate, hungry stance against evil in all of its forms? Because we've become friends with certain types of evil. Out of convenience, out of laziness, out of a lack of concern or care. I know I'm the statistics guy, but I was looking at a new map, actually done by a Finnish research place. Europe in 2050 No, was it 2050 or 2100? I can't remember. It may have been, it was in the future. It was showing the percentage, the largest percentage of religion, what religion would be the largest percentage of the population in all of Europe by this time. I think it was 2050. I was on medication when I was looking at this, so I'm sorry I don't know 100%. I'll just offer to you, I don't know how many countries are in Europe. How many countries are in Europe? Okay, a lot. She was a geography teacher. I was thinking she might know. I was kind of putting her on the spot unfairly. There are a lot of countries in Europe. I don't know them all. 3 of them were Christian. You don't need me to tell you what the other ones were. All of them. All of them. Oh, but they believe the same thing we do. They're just like us. I've shared with you the story of my son being told an absolute fabrication of the truth when he was in community college. I've now learned a new story of my sweet daughter-in-law-to-be being told an absolute fabrication of the truth of Christianity while she's at community college. You think it's not being taught. You think there's no way in the world we'd actually be teaching the wrong, but we are. Well, then somebody, you ready? Somebody ought to do something. You want to do a physical exercise real quick? If you're right-handed, take your right hand out and do this. If you're left-handed, take your left hand out and do this. So see, I would do this. Most of you do that. Now you're going to take that index finger, you're going to point it at your chest. And now I want you to do this. Somebody. Yes, say it. Somebody. You are the somebody. More children just participated with me than adults. Is it because it's a stupid exercise? Or because I don't want a physical reminder that it's me that he put here to do it? I don't want to have to stand up and because it looks stupid. It's the same reason you won't let him turn over a table. Because if I let him turn over that table, then people are going to know what was on that table. They're going to know about that mess I was keeping inside. They were going to know about those things I was doing in the shadows. They were going to know about all that dark. So I'm going to keep that table in the corner, and he's not allowed to touch it. But is it Fifth Sunday? I'm going to have some communion. I'm going to do this often in remembrance of him. I'm going to worship the risen Christ with my idol on the wall. My children and your children are being given away because we have the truth. We won't live it. We won't let him turn over the table. And we won't sit at the table we belong and let him set the table that we ought to be at. And I'm not overly doom and gloom. I am more doom and gloom than my spouse. She's the positive half of us. But I assure you that the same thing that's been true for all of time is true today. If you won't change, then nothing changes. I don't know what to do. I got good news. Neither do I. I just know the one who does. And I know that instead of trying to get him to tell me what to do in my context, in this moment, how do I help Israel? How do I help Maine? How do I help New York? How do I help my neighbor? I first better make sure that I know what he told me to have been doing already, so that I make sure the table is clear in here. Because I want you to wonder to yourself, what would happen if every person who was a somebody handled their table with Jesus? All of a sudden, I got a lot less to deal with, don't I? There are tables to set, and those tables are for restoration and reminder, encouragement, teaching. There are tables in which the Father sits with us. But there are tables to turn over. And I would imagine that every one of us has one. And so my prayer, as I'm asking now for your mind to just shift ever so slightly to there you are that night, but you're reclining at his table. Judas is there with us. None of us really know what's going to happen with that. Judas doesn't even really know. been weird how he had us set this Passover up in the first place, right? I mean, we've had Passover with him before. He starts his ministry at 30, and he ends his ministry either 33, 34, depending on how we're going to calculate things out. That's a minimum of 3 Passovers. We've done this twice before, and twice before he didn't say nothing about going to get a colt and going to find this random guy and say, hey, the master's going to use your upstairs tonight. You know, none of that stuff happened before, but we did what he told us, and here we are. We have the same Passover, the same lessons there to learn. God's provision, protection from death, the need to be ready to go, and the fact that he called and we've gone. And we can draw encouragement from that lesson together because sitting here in this room with us, or with him, we're the ones that got up and got. Come follow me and I will make you fishers of men. Mark says, and Peter immediately left his nets and followed him. I got up and went, man. I did it. There's weird stuff with the foot washing. Peter stuck his foot in his mouth, literally. Well, not literally, but. And then Jesus says something about somebody in the room is going to betray him. Pause. When he says that, when the Bible says that Jesus says to them, one of you in this room with me, one of you at this table, you're going to betray me. They didn't all turn and look at Judas. Hey, it's him? Did they? They all asked the same question. Is it me? Why are they asking that? Do they not know? Do they not know it ain't me? I'm not the guy who would sell out the master. Why would they ask, is it I? If they hadn't been tempted themselves to want to leave. There's a passage in Luke where Jesus tells some people hard things to hear. And it says a lot of people left, and Jesus looks at them, those that remained, and said, do you want to leave too? So maybe they had considered that before. Maybe you have too. Maybe before in your life you have thought, this isn't worth the work. This is too hard. If God is love, joy, peace, patience, if your yoke is easy, well, I'm just going to let you know, I don't feel any of that, so that makes you a liar, so I'm out. If you've never been that deep in a hole, God bless you. So maybe that's part of why they're all like, is it me? I mean, does he know the things I've been saying? Does he know what I was arguing about last night? So to ease everybody's mind, he says, it's the betrayer is the one who's about to dip his bread in here after me. And now you know Judas wasn't even listening. What kind of a fool? Let's just put this into some context. Jesus is holding the bowl. The betrayer is the one who puts his hand in this bowl with me. I mean, if I was paying attention, I'd be like, not me. But he dips that bread in the bowl and Judas, bloop. Is it me? That what you must do, go now and do it quickly. Judas gets up and leaves. So now we're back to that room. What's going on? What does he mean, betray? What's he talking about? He's been talking about death for all this time, and now he's talking about betrayal. And why did Judas get up and leave? Where did he just go? Should we go get him? And I'm filling in things. But somehow Jesus would have gotten their attention again. Fellas, look at me. And as their attention returned to him, all reclining around that table, he picks up that leavened bread. And he begins to explain to them that it's bread, but it's more than bread. I would offer to you that doing this doesn't mean the elements. It means sitting at the table with him. Be with me. be reminded that you have all of me. Body, blood, forgiveness, and grace. You have all of me. Sit here for a while. I invite you to ponder your willingness to sit with him in this way as you bow your heads.